everyone. I'm Ashna. I'm a PhD student at Environmental and Energy Policy Science Department. And my title of my presentation is Participatory Approach to Sustainability Assessments. Here, what I'm doing is basically, I did a review of several case studies from different countries in the world that use participatory approach to assess sustainability of their management strategies and different land use management strategies. And what I looked at are basically what are the issues that come up frequently in this implementation of participatory techniques, and what are the things that are missing from the idea of use of participatory technique in these implementations. So before I go on to case studies, I just want to briefly talk about what sustainability assessment is. Sustainability assessment is an important tool that is used to analyze and interpret long-term social, ecological, and economic goals of different interventions, policy, technological, and it has been frequently used to ensure that any given intervention is successfully implemented and they meet the sustainability goals of the community where they are being implemented. So usually a framework for sustainability assessment includes these 5 components, where first they are the spatial and temporal scope of the assessment is defined. They define what are the system boundary and what are the temporal scope of the intervention and of the assessment, and then they define sustainability. Sustainability, we feel like it is already a defined term, but often what happens is sustainability, definition of sustainability changes with priority and interest of communities, and so it needs to be defined when you're formulating framework for sustainability assessment. And next component is determining criteria that are to be measured that define sustainability in that area, in that field or community. And another component is measurement requirements of criteria that leads to indicators. Indicators are the basically the measure to represent criteria, and indicators that we use to measure the sustainability of any intervention should be, we should make sure that these indicators are accessible, robust, relevant, and they predictably respond to changes in the system. So this is the example as how criteria are defined by indicators and how they are presented in verifiers, so that we can see whether the interventions are sustainable or not. So here I'm presenting environment as an example of criteria where indicators are air quality and water quality, and they are basically measured in terms of different pollutants or these parameters. So this is how sustainability is measured for economic and social criteria too. So there are different approaches to assess or come up with criteria for assessing sustainability, and one very traditional type of approach is expert-driven or top-down, where let's say government researchers, they come up with the idea that environment of this certain place is being depleted, and this information goes on to policymakers and governments, and they think that based on whatever evidence research is present, they think that yeah, it is happening. So what usually happens is they come with these policies like policies and acts to conserve or protect environment, and what happens, they don't really know the real setting as how local stakeholders depend entirely on environment. They depend entirely on little things, little stocks from environment, and they just bar people from using environmental resources. That is basically an example of disadvantage of this top-down approach to assessing sustainability or coming up with criteria to define sustainability, and it has, as I mentioned, frequently been criticized for marginalizing local stakeholders, local issues, context, and local stakeholders' perception of vulnerability and risk. So some of the issues that are associated with expert-driven approach to coming up with indicators are often given a default equivalent weighting. Sometimes it is just one criteria that they focus on, and sometimes they try to be fair and include all social, environmental, and economic criteria. But in real life setting, it might or might not work that way. Local stakeholders may not follow the same indicator weighting and inclusion patterns. In certain community, environment are very important in their livelihoods. In some community, economic benefits should be taken into account for the sustainability of their community. So they have different priorities, and for sustainability of that particular community, these priority needs to be taken into account in the various levels. And also, these expert-driven approaches often do not take into account diverse demands from different sectors of the community, and the use and the fact that local stakeholders depend on these different resources differently at different levels are often undervalued, and they are so this is another approach, which is bottom-up participatory approach, which basically has these three components where in decision making and in coming up with indicators for sustainability, all this knowledge, theoretical base and practical knowledge from the community are taken into account, and the experiences that the community have based on resource use and risk are taken into account in coming up with indicators and to come up with definition for sustainability for that particular community. So here are some merits that I came up with frequently while reading through this literature are that in participatory approach to coming up with or decision making are often democratic, and they are often transparent, and they are also helpful. They have been found helpful in reducing conflict between different uses of resources and different priorities within the community, between different stakeholders. and it has also been found helpful in building trust of local stakeholders on policymakers and researchers, because they are basically taking part in understanding the dynamics within the society and the system as a whole. And because they are community and researchers both are taking part into understanding the system, it helps in social learning too. So my review, I reviewed several case studies which comes from several different areas of the parts of the world, and they are basically they are implemented in natural resource management area, and so these are 5 key areas that case studies I reviewed cover. First, management practices in these 4 countries: Ethiopia, Indonesia, Kyrgyzstan, Nepal, and other areas: land use management, sustainable agriculture, fishery, and technology dissemination, biofuel use, technology dissemination in Kenya. I will not go in detail as what I found in each different cases. I'm just generalizing, and I'm listing different things I learned from these case studies, and this is here. So first thing I noticed about is implementation are types of participatory approach. Even within this participatory approach, there are 2 different ways to implement participatory technique. One is expert-assisted approach, where local stakeholders are given the full responsibility of holding this assessment, and researchers, they only take role of mediator or facilitator. And in first one, local stakeholders define sustainability. They are while defining sustainability, they come up with issues, and researchers, they only help to put them into scientific language, and they are basically assisting local stakeholders to come up with accessible, relevant, and robust set of indicators. And they have a certain level of discussion and discussions to agree upon one final set of indicators. And second approach was expert-initiated, where they use experts' conceptualization of sustainability. They come up with a list of indicators that have been developed by experts, but local stakeholders, they work on contextualizing this list of indicators so that they can be used at in their community. So the indicators are originating from expert-driven approach, but then it takes into form of local stakeholders or participatory list of indicators in this case. And in literature, when I went through these case studies, definition of participatory was found to vary between cases, and 2 common ways of defining participatory are community-based, where only end users are taken into account or involved in decision making, and another is system-based, where different actors in the community are involved in decision making, like representatives from public, private, and government. And it basically is more broad, and takes system-based, takes more time and resources, and it is more intensive. And indicators that they came up with also range from just 15 indicators to 200 indicators, and they are, as we had thought, indicators were not equally distributed between different criteria like environment, economic. Some were some had more indicators in environment, and some had less indicators in more indicators in economic criteria. So it all depended on how differently they prioritize these criteria. And indicators were also often too general when local stakeholders were allowed to come up with this idea for different indicators, and they often required researchers' help in identify which were measurable and which were not, which were relevant and which were not. Like in case from Malawi, farmers were involved in deciding on indicators, and they came up with whether they would be able to grow more crops, things like they were more into agricultural practices than environmental and economic benefit of agriculture. And so these case studies did highlight the need for researchers' assistance in helping local stakeholders to understand the relevance and measurability of these indicators. And another issue that these case studies highlighted was sustainability goals are often not very clear among local stakeholders, and their decisions were often driven by their immediate needs and requirements, and also for researchers to begin to develop this community-based or participatory framework for sustainability assessment, there was not a very good consistency in identification of stakeholders. In some, sorry. How do we go back? Yes, so there is this inconsistency in how to identify stakeholders, and also no consensus was observed in optimal representation from different, when they try to include representatives from different sectors, especially in system-based participation. They often had just one community member, and they called it participatory technique. So that also that was found pretty common in common practice in implementing participatory technique to come up with indicators. And another thing that interested me was collaborative learning. When participatory technique is thought of as opportunity for collaborative learning between researchers and community members, but it was not found to be implemented in few, and often researchers would go in community and ask for information, and they would come up with their own indicators, and often that often did not incorporate this idea of collaborative learning, because local people would not understand how other components of the system are interacting with the component they are representing, and also they would not know how their idea are being used up in the formulation of indicators. So, however, in the cases where collaborative learning was used, it was realized that collaborative learning did allow for holistic understanding of the system, and did allow for identification of conflicts and how to deal with these conflicts between different stakeholders. And it also did allow researchers opportunity to develop this trust and cordial relationship with stakeholders, so that they could both work collaboratively.
Please, time constraint for the next speaker.
So I can just wrap up and include points with conclusion. My review came up with the conclusion that the participatory approach to assess sustainability does increase this buy-in, which helps local stakeholders to accept and feel like part of the assessment process, and it does enhances understanding of researchers and stakeholders, both to understand system dynamics and how different components in the system work, and it helps in it also helps to contribute offsetting different biases and prejudices among researchers as well as stakeholders about different issues in the community, and it also contributes to the capacity building of community and make them feel like they are really part of policy making, so that the implementation of policy making can be really eased, and it also contributed to the effective and democratic implementation of governmental intervention. This is the things underlined by people who actually evaluated the participatory technique in sustainability assessment of different cases.
Thank you very much. We have, I think we can take one question only, if there is any. Well, let's thank Ajma for giving this presentation on this broad interesting topic. Now we have our final